Dr. Nikki Cooley and Dr. Alistair Reid would like to welcome you to Lecture 14 on the topic of plant adaptation to climate change. This lecture is framed as a review and a revision aid for this subject rather than a comprehensive overview of plant climate change. The topic is taught in the subject Plant Physiology, which is a component of the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology, a degree that is offered by both Melbourne Polytechnic and La Trobe University. Please visit our website at www.melbournepolytechnic.edu.au for further information on this topic and other subjects that we offer. My name is Dr. Nikki Cooley. We started this subject by defining plant physiology as a subdiscipline of botany concerned with the fundamental or physiology of plants. We have learnt about many of these processes. Some we have learnt by taking a virtual journey through the plants, starting at the root and travelling all the way through to the leaves and then back through to the roots again. Some of the fundamental processes that we have now covered include photosynthesis, plant nutrition, plant hormone functions, photomorphogenesis, environmental stress physiology, germination, growth and development, stomatal function and transpiration. In this subject you have learnt about some of these processes. In this review lecture we will consider these processes and mechanisms. They will be presented in a climate change or climate adaptation scenario. As students, this framing will give you a chance to test your understanding. That is, if you hear about a plant mechanism, process or response, and you do not understand it in the context presented, then it will give you a chance to review this topic or section and thus prepare for the examination. The first stage of your review will be to look at the major concepts that we have covered in this process. The predominant concept will be plant growth and development. This is a fundamental process of plant life. By learning about plant growth and development, we have learnt about plant structure and function, plant water use, plant fertigation, yield components and interactions with the environment, and plant communication and defence. Once you have reviewed these major components of the subject, you are then ready to test your understanding. The aim of this lecture will be for you to examine your understanding of plant physiology. We will overview climate change and climate consequences and determine the physiological effects, including photosynthesis, growth, yield, and nutrient assimilation. Relative temperature changes, that is a range in degrees, for the period 2020 to 29 and again 2090 to 2099 have been modelled. These are relative to 1980 to 1999 data. Models all agree a global increase in temperature. They range as to how much that temperature change may be. While a few degrees increase may not sound much, if you equate it to all the increased energy that will be entering into the climate, this change is massive. Anything above a 2-degree global temperature increase will have dramatic impacts on plant growth and development. Not only is there predicted to be an increase in global temperature, but also significant changes to global precipitation. Relative changes in precipitation, indicated as a percent, for the period 2090 to 2099 have been modelled, and these are relative to 1980 to 1999 data. These changes in some locations around the world are dramatic, and less changes near the equator. There are some areas in white where the models do not agree enough to plot an average change. If these models are correct, this introduces uncertainty to water availability to plants, which will again potentially have significant impacts on plant growth and development. So, what are fundamental processes of plant life? Let's start by defining these, and then we can examine how they may be impacted in climate change. When we think of water uptake, we think of solute transport, which occurs in the xylem vessels. We may also think about transpirational compromise, water potential, and the environmental influence on these processes. Photosynthesis is another important fundamental process of plant life. We will understand components of how light is converted into chemical energy. This involves carbon reactions and physiological aspects. We also understand that there are different carbon reactions across the plant kingdom. These include C3, C4 and CAN. We have also looked at carbohydrate and carbohydrate partitioning and the mechanism of phloem loading and unloading and the role that it plays in this mechanism. This helps us to understand source-sink relationships, an important component of plant growth and development. We have also learnt about roots, oxygen and storage assimilates. How do plants absorb the nutrients and how do they use them? These are all fundamental processes of plant life. Another way we can look at understanding the fundamentals is to define them from an agricultural perspective. These are most importantly yield. Yield is determined by photosynthesis, the amount and the efficiency. The ability of a plant to produce carbohydrates and store them. The ability of a plant to transport these carbohydrates when they are required for plant growth and development. And the ability of a plant to obtain nutrients, both in the quality and the quantity, to transport these nutrients, and to not undergo any deficiencies or toxicities. When all of these components are optimal, your yield is optimal. Transpiration is another important component from an agricultural perspective. The water used from the cell to the whole plant. This involves an understanding of xylem transport, root intake of water, and transpirational compromise. Plant defense and plant signaling and control are also important agricultural components of plant physiology. To optimise economic return in many agronomic enterprises, it is often important in obtaining the best quality yield for your crop-environment interaction. Climate change predictions are of a higher temperature, later frosts, increased carbon dioxide concentrations, as well as an increased variability in the climate. All of these can result in conflicting impacts on yield. Well, what do we mean? For example, a later frost, that is one that occurs in the spring, can have negative impact on potential yield by destroying developing buds, which reduces vegetative production, and reducing flower number, flower set, and/or fertilization processes in some plants. While an increased temperature impact will largely depend on the species, the degree of temperature increase, and the timing that the temperature is exposed, that the plant is exposed to the temperature increase. In some situations, a temperature can increase in yield when the temperature increase allows key enzymes in photosynthesis growth and development to function more optimally. However, in Australia, many of the crops that are grown commercially are growing at above optimal temperatures, and therefore temperature becomes a stress. When temperature is a stress, shortening of developmental phases have been recognised as one of the potential responses. Reduced light perception over the shortened life cycle will increase the association of reduction in yield. This will also play havoc on plant carbon balance. These were observations described by Barbanas et al. in 2008. Temperature stress can reduce net carbon gain by increasing plant respiration more than photosynthesis. In fact, light-saturated photosynthesis of C3 plants, such as the crop wheat and rice, is at a maximum for temperatures from about 20 degrees to 32 degrees C, whereas total crop respiration shows a steep non-linear increase for temperatures from 15 to 14 degrees C. This is followed by a rapid and nearly linear decline, as shown by Porter and Smirnoff in 2005. Therefore, an increase in temperature could potentially reduce photosynthetic capacity due to the heat liability of rubisco activities, on one hand, and the limitation of the electron transport and chloroplasts on the other hand, as stated by Sage et al. In 2008. In addition, by increasing the air evaporative demand, higher temperatures are often implicated with stomata closure and further decreases photosynthesis due to carbon dioxide flux in leaves. So I'm not going to attempt to give a definitive answer about how climate change predictions may impact on yield of crops grown in Australia. The summary that I have just concluded has given you insights into the process of photosynthesis, photosynthetic efficiency, plant growth and development, respiration, and key components within those just stated. I have also touched on transpiration, evaporative demand, and stomata. So therefore, when you are revising this topic, perhaps think firstly about what are the processes that a plant uses in order to obtain an optimal yield. List these processes along with the associated lectures they were discussed in. Then, when you are reviewing the topic of yield, you will be able to refer to the relevant components and parts of your notes. The other question you should ask yourself in this summary: did you understand these processes when I was describing them? Could you realize the mechanism and understand how the change that I was describing impacts on the plants? If not, it's worth going back to the list that you have just made and reviewing each of these sections to give you an overall understanding of yield. Here is an example of a possible exam question on yield and plant responses. To optimize an economic return in many agronomic enterprises, it is often important in obtaining the best potential yield for your crop-environmental interaction. Please list the inputs that can impact on plant growth and articulate how these inputs may optimize yield. This is an excellent question on yield because it allows you to demonstrate much of your knowledge base. You would start by suggesting such inputs as temperature, available water, CO2 concentrations, nutrient availability, and soil. There are other inputs that you could list, but these are perhaps the most important. You could then describe how these inputs play a role in plant growth and how they then impact on yield. You could describe briefly the stages of growth from the zygote to reproductive stages. You could describe the roles that optimal nutrition plays in plant growth and development. You could describe how temperature increases may promote growth, but more often than not will inhibit growth. You can also describe the important role of CO2 concentration, particularly that pertaining to C3 plants. This question, when written as a long answer, enables much opportunity for you to demonstrate your knowledge. Have a go at constructing an ideal response to this exam question. You can then use this as part of your revision notes. Another important process in the plant is that of transpiration. Climate change predictions state that we are likely to receive higher temperatures, changes to humidity, increased CO2 concentration, and all of these are bound to impact on evaporative transpiration. This will lead to an impact on transpiration. So let us look at this in a bit more detail. Currently, carbon dioxide concentrations are related to the impact on stomatal conductance. As stomatal conductance increases through the opening of stomata, the loss of water is initiated. The higher the opening, the higher the loss of water. Overall, in both C3 and C4 plants, it is estimated that stomatal conductance is consistently but not universally decreased as carbon dioxide levels increase. This has been stated by several authors such as Ainsworth and Long in 2005, Leckie et al. In 2009, and Ziska and Brounce in 2006. Because increasing atmospheric CO2 enlarges the gradient needed to ensure adequate diffusion of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the chloroplast, greater photosynthetic rates for a given stomatal conductance paralleling lower transpiration rates are to be expected. Thus, ultimately, you will save water in drought conditions. When you are learning about transpiration, the first thing that I would recommend is to define it. Then describe the mechanisms that underpin transpiration. These mechanisms cover both water use from cell-to-cell water transport through to water movement through the whole plant. We are predominantly defining xylem transport when we are talking about transpiration. What is the transpirational compromise? This was proposed in the lecture on transpiration. If you cannot remember, go back and revise. How is water taken up by the roots? What are the function of the root hairs? What are the pathways from root hair to xylem? Can you name them? Can you describe them? How does the climate influence both the pathway of water uptake and the whole plant transpiration of water? We have just talked about CO2 concentrations. But if you have higher temperatures and changes to humidity, how might this impact on transpiration rates? What are the chemical signals that aid transpiration control in plants? Plant nutrition is an important learning outcome for this subject. It is important in many agronomic enterprises, as optimal nutrient allows optimal growth and development, yield and quality in many crops. If we look at climate change predictions of higher temperatures, we note that this will have many and complicated changes to plant nutrition. It is worth noting that water availability may impact on soil nutrient micromovement and the plant's ability to uptake this nutrients through the roots. Significant impacts to transpiration caused by climate change predictions may also impact on nutrient availability, as transpirational pool plays an important process. Elevated temperatures, especially if coupled with drought stress, are associated with smaller, more fibrous leaves, which usually exhibit in changes in nutritional quality. For example, decreasing nitrogen and increasing tannins and phenols, as described by Morrison and Lawyer in 1995. At elevated CO2, tannin and terpene contains also usually increase, especially under ample nitrogen, as described by Izzo in 2001. Despite these negative impacts on food quality, carbon dioxide enrichment may have positive effects. For example, vitamin C is increased by 5% in orange juice harvested from optimally fertilized trees, grown under twice as much ambient carbon dioxide. Elevated carbon dioxide has also been demonstrated to increase the production of heat-helping dioxin in the woody foxglove, which is a poison. This is also a cancer-fighting substance which is found in a common spider lily. As stated extensively in the section on DeMatter et al., nitrogen availability to plants more than any other environmental factor determines their response to elevated carbon dioxide, as stated by Ellsworth in 2004. This has been associated with the fact that elevated carbon dioxide results in decreased nitrogen content, typically by between 13 to 16% in plant tissues, regardless of the CO2 enrichment technology. Although the mechanism by which elevated CO2 decreases, tissue concentration of nitrogen, and therefore proteins, are not yet fully understood. Such decreases exceed that would be expected if a given amount of nitrogen were diluted by additional biomass, as stated by Bloom in 2006. There is more detail on this response in the DMATA paper that you can read at your leisure. When interpreting an exam question on plant nutrition, it is best to start with a definition. Try to link the various nutrient inputs with different mechanisms. That is, do you understand what mechanisms use nitrogen, for example? Could you list them? Could you also describe the efficiencies and the toxicities? There are many examples given throughout this subject. So let us have a look at plant defense. This is the physical and chemical secondary plant metabolites. What physical attributes do plants possess in order to protect themselves against attack? Can you give some examples of plant biochemical defense that aid in both the resistance and the defense? What role does nutrition play in plant health? These are all aspects to consider when studying plant defense. Changes to climate, that is, higher temperatures, will change the growth rate of weeds, and this will have a negative impact potentially on crop growing. The growth and reproductive cycle of some pests will change. When looking at these, you will need to look at a complex ecosystem, not just the plant. And so predicting what will happen in future changes is very complex and requires sophisticated models. Another issue is that new diseases may occur. Therefore, we can probably expect to have increased herbicide and pesticide use and potentially increased resistance. With the lecture and the associated workshop, we examined 6 different types of hormones in this subject: auxins, gibberellics, cytokinins, ethylene, ascorbic acid, and the steroids. We also examined briefly other signaling molecules such as jasmic acid, salicylic acid, small proteins, styrolactone, and flavonoids. We will not talk extensively here about climate change impacts, but concentrate on the role that these play in plants, their impacts on growth and development, and other mechanisms such as photosynthesis and transpiration. It is also worth noting that some hormones work together. Can you list these and the responses they give? In general, the impact on plant signaling control will be very complicated and specific to each individual hormone, not just specific to the group of hormones, and so will not be covered in detail here. Please ensure that you understand the role that hormones play in plant signaling. Ensure that you can compile several examples for preparation for your exam. In summary, the response of plants to climate change is very complex. Responses will be directed by the species, the mechanism, and the geographic location. What I mean by these is a wheat plant may respond differently to a set of climate inputs than an oat plant. Photosynthesis may respond differently to a set of climate inputs than respiration. And an oat plant grown in Florida may respond quite differently to an oat plant grown in Australia in future climates. And this is because different geographical locations will have different climate inputs. Use the outline here and the paper by DMATA et al. To test your understanding and thus direct your research efforts. I want to take this time now to thank you for studying plant physiology. I hope that you have enjoyed studying this subject and that you will take the time to reflect on just how truly complex and amazing the plant kingdom is. My name is Dr. Nikki Cooley.